Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. The war in Iran is apparently on hold. No bombing as such, but no resolution. A long ceasefire, perhaps, or rather one indefinitely extended by a surprise announcement last night by President Trump. We're recording on Wednesday, the 22nd of April. To date, we've focused on the war itself in the past few episodes, but now it's time to look at the broader impacts, notably in Asia and Europe. Shihoko Goto is the Vice President for Programs at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and head of the Asia Program. Rebecca Christie is a Senior Fellow at Bruegel and host of the Sound of Economics podcast. We are delighted to welcome both of them here to talk to us, and to each other, of course, about events and developments in Asia and Europe. First of all, welcome back, Rebecca. We've already been delighted to have you with us before in an excellent episode. And welcome to you, Shihoko, for the first time. And as is always the inauguration here, can you just tell us a little bit about your career and how you got to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It's really great to join my really good friend Rebecca, and it's really wonderful to meet you, Ilana, as well. I actually grew up in Brussels, and my academic career actually started off focusing on European history, but for graduate school, I made a pivot, both intellectually and also geographically. I am originally from Japan. I moved back to Tokyo, and I focused on international relations and political theory in particular. Professionally, I had started off as a financial journalist, and that is the background that has really put me in my stead. I have spent time at the World Bank here in Washington, D.C., and for the past over a decade now, I have been in the think tank world, focusing on international economics and focusing especially on Asia and U.S. relations in particular.
Very good, and no doubt that's where the two of you originally met. Rebecca, tell us just a bit your update since we last spoke to you as your podcast.
So, yes, thank you so much for having me back on the podcast. And it is a delight to be sharing the air with Shihoko, who is one of the smartest and most perceptive people I know in this space or any other. I have been in Belgium for about 15 years total. And for the last 2.5 years, I have been the main host of The Sound of Economics, which is the flagship podcast of Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. So we try to explain the pressing economic issues of the day in ways that make the topics come alive and deepen people's understandings of what is going on. We have a separate podcast stream that focuses on European and China policy that is hosted by my colleagues. And you can get all of this for free on our website or all of your favorite podcast channels after you're done listening to this one.
Absolutely. After. Anyway, ladies, enough with the niceties. Let's jump right into it, because the war has had a particularly harsh impact on Asia, if one understands, but actually it's not being particularly nice to Europe either. Perhaps the best would be if each of you summarized what is exactly going on each continent. Shihoko, perhaps you could take us through it first.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, the war on Iran has been incredibly disruptive for Asian economies from an energy security perspective. And I think that is the immediate impact that we are seeing. But that has had a ripple effect. It has led to a reconsideration of alliances and partnerships, both on the economic front and the security front. And it is also leading to greater reassessment of their relationship with the United States more broadly as well. It's important to bear in mind, though, that Asia Yeah, just to say, Asia is vast. So there is a distinct divide between the wealthier, industrialized Asia of Northeast Asia, that is to say, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, as well as China. And then what we would probably term the global South, including Southeast Asia and South Asia. And so there, we should also keep that in mind as well. Yeah. Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines. These are countries that are incredible economic powerhouses, but when we look at the energy market, countries often have problems paying for the rising energy costs that will continue to fuel other economies. And so they are looking more to countries, the wealthier countries, either to subsidize or to provide some kind of energy credit to them as well, at a time when all these Asian countries are facing great vulnerabilities as a result of the ongoing war in Iran. Just another point that I should make is that the energy shocks, the oil crisis of the Middle East is nothing new to Asia. This is
So the global South in this case would be very much India, Bangladesh, Pakistan.
Yeah. Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines. These are countries that are incredible economic powerhouses, but when we look at the energy market, countries often have problems paying for the rising energy costs that will continue to fuel other economies. And so they are looking more to countries, the wealthier countries, either to subsidize or to provide some kind of energy credit to them as well, at a time when all these Asian countries are facing great vulnerabilities as a result of the ongoing war in Iran. Just another point that I should make is that the energy shocks, the oil crisis of the Middle East is nothing new to Asia. This is it's a scenario that's played out in the 1970s. And there had been expectations that lessons from the 1970s had been learned, and so that these Asian economies would be more resilient to disruptions from the Middle East, and that they will have diversified their energy sources as well. And yes, we have seen that, but some countries have been more successful in diversifying their energy sources more than others. And although China is the single biggest importer of oil from Iran, it has also been one of the most successful in being able to diversify. And so when we look, for instance, at the green technology that China has invested in, not least the BYDs and the EVs that China produces, we see that, and the solar panels that they produce and dominate in, we see a China where the green technology investments have really paid off. And then in terms of energy sources, coal is one of the driving sources of their energy as well. And we see that is also reducing its vulnerabilities for Middle East. And remember, it's not just imports from Iran, but the whole blockade of the Strait of Hormuz that is leading to this vulnerability and lack of access to oil from the region. So we are seeing dividends pay out for China on the one hand, and other countries scrambling much more to secure their sources, both in the near term and then rethinking their longer term trajectory.
Very interesting. We'll come back to that in a minute. I think we should also add in that a lot of airlines in Asia are already cancelling flights, have cancelled many flights. I think in the month of March, globally, something like 92,000 flights were cancelled, of which the majority were in Asia. So that's just keep in mind too.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, if I may, what's also happening with all these flights is that there were options for a lot of Asian passengers. They could go via the Middle East via hubs in Dubai in particular, but that option is really no longer available, and it's just much more expensive because the route has become longer to avoid some of the more restricted airspaces. And with that and the increase in jet fuel, it's a lot more expensive to go to Europe, and it's a lot less options. And so there is a change in demand as well as flight patterns.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you so much. We'll come back to Asia, but Rebecca, give us a sense of what's happening in one way or another in Europe. What's the effect?
This is the second big geopolitical energy shock that Europe has had to deal with in recent years. In 2022, when Russia commenced its full-scale attempted invasion of Ukraine, energy prices spiked. The EU had to pivot very quickly to really change its entire approach to natural gas in particular supplies, and also a little bit oil. At that time, prices went up and then came back down. And the question this time around, with the fighting over the Strait of Hormuz after the US and Israeli action toward Iran, has been, is this something that will last for a long time, or is this something that is temporary? So far, people have been hoping that it is temporary and that the energy price spikes are just something that will come and go. If it turns out to be a longer disruption, then some really hard choices will need to be made. We already see that today there was a breakthrough in the question over EU lending money to Ukraine. And this is something that had been held up because of opposition from the outgoing Hungarian government and Viktor Orban. The incoming Hungarian government with Peter Magyar was seen as more sympathetic, but it didn't even get that far. Instead, Ukraine said that it would turn back on the pipeline, piping fossil fuels from Russia through Ukraine to Slovakia and Hungary. And this was all it took to do a deal, because if you are seeing shortages, then you want to have extra energy supplies. And so now the EU is on track to loan this 90 billion to Ukraine. So it's a big issue. We're also hearing, we were talking about airlines. There's a sense that jet fuel is in more of a shortage situation in the EU than it is in the US. The EU does have a strategic reserve of a sort, but there's also talk. One of the European Commission's senior officials was out talking about possibly having mandatory sharing as opposed to just voluntarily. They might be required as a condition of using these reserves to make sure that people can have fuel when necessary to keep their flights going. So we're in the medium term right now. The short-term disruption has mostly been adjusted for. The medium term, there are some changes being made. And then the long term, there is so much uncertainty. We just don't know.
Let me ask you both before we go into each issue. Clearly, nobody knows, how could you, whether the Trump administration had planned for this as an outcome. But in serious terms, given this is Trump too, given all the disruption that has gone before, have people in neither continent considered that this could be an issue that one day would happen, and that having a choke point being held by a country that, to put it mildly, is not entirely reliable is going to be a problem one day? Yeah.
This whole conflict is so wild because if there's one area that military strategists have been looking at for the past couple of decades, it's the Strait of Hormuz. If you do a search on maritime security and the Strait of Hormuz, you will come up with so much scholarship on military activity, economic dependence, international dynamics, all of these things. To have a situation now where a conflict has started, it's really not clear what the objectives of this conflict are or who's in charge. Is Iran in charge? Is the US blockade now in charge? It's all very vague and we don't know. And particularly for Europe, which has been trying to stay out of it and not align itself with too many irrational actors where possible, they don't even know who they need to be working with. French ships, we're hearing, are getting caught up in this, even though they're so far, I believe, non-combatants. So it's a hard situation.
What was the perception in Asia?
Yeah. So if I can just step back and answer your question about expectations for the scenario for the United States, this was not supposed to take this long, right? And this was supposed to be an easy, swift, decisive win for the United States. And so we are seeing Iran really being able to confront and face the United States. And we are in a quagmire. The United States has called upon its allies in Europe as well as Asia to come to its support. And that rally from Asia as well as from Europe has not been forthcoming, and that has led to a lot of tension between the United States and Asia and Europe as well. The response from Asia is really, one, can the United States be part of the solution in meeting some of Asia's immediate energy needs? Remember, the United States is actually a net exporter of energy. And so we had already been seeing investments in U.S. energy projects, especially from Japan. That is only going to intensify, and the actual exports today from the United States are expected to continue. In the medium term, however, there is a reassessment of to what extent the United States is going to be a reliable partner. We should also bear in mind that when we talk about chokeholds, yes, the Strait of Hormuz has been highlighted as a particular vulnerability. Panama Canal is another one. Strait of Malacca, Taiwan Strait, all of these are vulnerable. But we should bear in mind that this whole idea of economic coercion, the weaponization of the advantages that a particular country may have over another, has been a part of a broader conversation about what kind of economic security visions should countries have, what kind of economic security alliances could move forward. We are seeing amongst a lot of Asian countries, especially amongst the wealthier ones, is greater cooperation on the economic security front and what that could look like. We had already seen conversations about greater supply chain resiliency coordination, greater cooperation when it comes to development and the sustainability of critical mineral supplies. We are going to see greater cooperation and coordination on the energy front as well. The question really is about how deep is it going to be, how fast is it going to be, and which countries are going to be involved in these. Traditionally, when we talk about economic relations, oftentimes we focus much more on trade relations, but this is much more going to be about, as the rise of economic state becomes our new reality, how can we counterbalance that kind of hostility amongst like-minded countries and partners, and what kind of, what is the longer-term vision? Is it going to be on specific issues as they arise, or can there be a more defensive, coordinated action?
To be just very clear to the uninitiated, Asia is poor in fossil fuels?
Yes.
I mean, this dependence comes from an absence of.
Yes, especially in the highly industrialized advanced technology countries like Japan, South Korea, as well as Taiwan, and indeed China. And China, despite its size, it is actually very poor in oil and petroleum, as well as in liquefied natural gas. So they are very dependent, not just from sources in the Middle East, but also from Southeast Asia, as well as Australia as well. And we've seen efforts to diversify, but what we have discovered is just how dependent many Asian countries still had been to sources from the Middle East.
That's very, very interesting. Rebecca, we know that Europe is not particularly rich in anything but coal, but it nonetheless has been talking for so long, definitely since 2022, but long before that, about diversifying green energy, etc. What's not happening?
It's more a question of scale. The EU has been pursuing the green transition. They've really been moving into renewables like solar and wind, but we don't have equal access to those things throughout the EU. Some countries are cloudy and landlocked, while other countries have a lot of sun and access to nice ocean breezes. There was, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, a move to start working more closely with imports of U.S. liquefied natural gas. Of course, the U.S. is now a very different sort of trading and security partner than it was even just a few years ago. And then internally, the EU is not yet all in on the idea of a joined up energy grid. My colleagues at Bruegel have written some wonderful things that have convinced me that a single market for energy, really making it easy for electricity to move from country to country, would do a whole lot for boosting economic growth and helping insulate the EU from some of these shocks. But it's very hard. It's hard to tax. It's hard to plan for. You can't really look at an electron and see where it's made. Getting from where we are now into this end state where everyone is sharing their energy resources in the most efficient and cost-effective way, it's a big ask.
But nonetheless, it's been asking for a long time. I mean, I remember going back 20 years, 15 years, when you speak to energy companies. Well, first of all, energy companies tried forever to lobby against the transition. And though one of them ended up pointing out that the fact that the EU did subsidize a lot of green energy was in the end good for everyone because it forced the energy companies to make much more purified petroleum and there were good sides to it, but nonetheless we're still dependent on that origin. And it baffles, I think, the idea that you're going on at it for 20 years, but like every other element, I suspect, of the single market, it's always going to be problematic because those who believe that they will win always seem to not take into consideration those who think that they're going to lose out of it. But in this particular case, maybe it will be a shift. I don't know. What do you think will be the geostrategic effects, though, in Asia, but also in Europe of what's going on now? Because you mentioned right at the beginning, Shihoko, that this idea that they're going to have to reassess relationships.
Yeah. So we are in the midst calibrating economic partnerships and alliances. And we had seen the Trump administration under the second administration announce its Liberation Day a year ago. And that had been a wake-up call for a lot of countries, most countries in the world that had been slammed by tariffs about what kind of relationship, trading relationship they can have with the United States. The latest conflict in Iran has led that conversation to move even forward. And so if I take the example of Japan, it has continued to be a champion of a rules-based order. And it has this initiative called a Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which really talks less about values, but more about a commitment, regardless of the size of the economies of these Asian countries, to understand that shared rules, shared standards, these are actually going to benefit and make it easier to do business across Asia, across borders. So in some ways, the European model, the origins of the unity of Europe is something that has been inspirational to Asia, but that's never going to happen. So we're seeing this kind of coordination, cooperation on a smaller scale, especially through trade agreements like this CPTPP. Looking forward, what we are going to see from Asia, greater coordination on specific issues. So I raised this idea of critical minerals, coordination, semiconductor development coordination. Now it's going to be much more focused on energy. And there will also be, what we haven't really talked about is that this isn't simply going to be government-led initiatives. We do need to have the private sector involved as well. None of these initiatives are going to come just from the public sector. But bear in mind that just like semiconductors, energy companies are rivals. And they are driven by profit. And so this is going to be a big challenge, unlike the military front, where there is, like, it's not necessarily simply about the bottom line. The borders, the objectives are clear. The idea of defense is very clear. That is not the case when it comes to economic identity. And then just to kind of close the loop on the Japan issue, the Japan dilemma, Japan has championed this rules-based order. At the same time, when it comes to military security, it has no choice but to continue to have the United States as its critical main principal partner in providing security in an increasingly unstable Indo-Pacific region. It can, however, on the economic front, be more creative. But at the same time, when we're seeing greater overlap between economic security and military concerns, the rules are going to be much more difficult to define. So that's going to be a challenge as well.
How do you think it's going to happen in Europe, Rebecca?
So to build on what we were just talking about, I would say that these crisis points do push things forward. The energy situation was very much stalled and tied to legacy interests and legacy ideas until Europe had to pivot in a hurry to wean itself off cheap Russian gas and, to a lesser extent, cheap Russian oil. And it did. It really did do a good job of refilling the supplies and diversifying where the energy was coming from and essentially stopping buying Russian national gas. And that was a big deal. We also saw with Asia, for example, when the U.S. and the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, the idea of getting an alliance that did not include China to work together to sort of counteract China's economic power, when that fell apart, this CBTP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I have to look it up every single time. It is essentially the Pacific trade deal without the U.S. as well as without China. And it has come together relatively quickly as these things go and been a real forum for doing stuff. So what does this mean for Europe right now? It means that we're going to see a bigger pivot toward these renewables, toward looking at some of these historically intractable energy border differences. For example, France and Spain are now working together in ways that were really unthinkable not so long ago, when we were still talking about how the Iberian Peninsula was really cut off from the rest of Europe from an energy perspective. And we're doing things like we're talking about nuclear again. Nuclear in Europe was very out of fashion, while it continued to be part of the discussion in the UK and also in France. Everyone else in Europe was like, yeah, no, we don't want this to be part of our green financing. Now the French and others are coming back saying, well, at least we don't need any Russian fossil fuels for this. And the final piece of this is that the war in Iran has strengthened Russia, has driven the price for their oil up to whoever's buying it, whether through this pipeline we were just talking about, the oil pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia, but also all around the world. Anybody buying Russian oil is now paying more for it. And the focus of the world is now on more than one active military conflict. And this is to Russia's benefit, given its ongoing military conflict. So it changes the balance of power. For China, which so far is an economic and not a military actor, it adds to the very complicated calculus the Chinese leadership is making about who they're going to align with, where their economic interests lie. I think it does point to how important they have become. I would say not that it increases their influence, but rather that it changes where their influence is most effective and gives them different points of entry into the types of economic dependence that some countries have on China and related supply chain.
I think you're pointing out some, really excellent things. I keep thinking that we haven't mentioned one very important one, which is that both Asia and Europe are amongst the most crowded, intensely populated areas in the world. Only Africa is more than Europe, but Europe has got 450 million people on it in a very tiny landmass. And of course, in Asia, there are large parts of it, other than parts of Russia and China, that are very intensely populated. So the need for energy is also quite different from that point of view. There's no doubt about it. When I'm listening to you, Rebecca, I'm thinking, why do politicians not want to learn anything, even if the policy people try and tell them? And when I'm listening to you, Shihoko, I have exactly the same. Let me give you a tiny example. 31 years ago, I arrived in Bosnia, Herzegovina, as the war was ongoing there. And one of the biggest issues was the pipeline, because Serbia and then Bosnia was connected to the same pipeline that Hungary was. And Hungary was always wanting to be paid, never got paid, so cut off the energy. This is 31 years ago. We know about pipelines. So there was always a rush to pay to try and reconnect it before somebody bombed it. That was something else. But we know about these points of failure, and yet they're constantly overlooked. Is it the same in Asia?
Well, yes. It is a loaded political question, because you're essentially asking about where has the political will been, right? And so oftentimes the motivation is to answer immediate pressing issues. Asia, of course, is the most populous region in the world. It's also the most dynamic. It has a very young population, especially when it comes to Southeast and South Asia compared to Northeast Asia, which is rapidly aging. Again, though, this is also where some of the biggest industries are located as well. So it's the energy demand is not just for heating and transportation, but it is also for the demand for petrochemicals to produce plastics and to produce goods for fertilizers and the like. It's incredibly intense. And so if these countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, are unable to afford the market price of energy, and we're facing a great deal of challenges in these countries, then the production of these goods also goes down, and then the cost of these goods also goes down as well. So the vulnerabilities are there from kind of like the heating and transportation, but also from a goods aspect. In terms of, hedging is going to be one of the biggest rallying cries. And we've already seen a lot of hedging going on. But let me give you the critical minerals example. China has already weaponized its critical minerals and rare earths supply. And this is seen as a great vulnerability for the global economy. And this is one of the biggest reasons why the United States hasn't been able to pursue the trade position that it had tried to push forward. But we know this. We've always known there are vulnerabilities, but it takes longer term strategic planning. And what we are seeing is a growth of industrial policy prerogatives. Industrial policy, especially in the United States, had traditionally been seen as anti-American, anti-free market. But when we are faced with the new geopolitical realities today, then there is going to have to be a longer term mapping out of where the needs are, where the vulnerabilities are, where there can be public financing in the private sector so that there is greater resilience to external shocks. What is really needed in this is strong political leadership and commitment, and some countries are going to be better at this than others.
For sure. For sure. And that's true also to Europe, I would have thought, no, Rebecca?
What I would say in Europe is that the green transition in the rest of the world is very much on policymakers' minds. Both in the neighborhood, you mentioned the Western Balkans. Bruegel, we just did a podcast on the energy transition in the Western Balkans, which is still very, very coal dependent. And they're going to be in line to be hit by this CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism for the carbon price within the EU. So this is something that they're looking at, that the EU is working on. For these countries that hope to join the EU one day, they have to come up with some sort of green energy transition, or at least coal diversification plan. And then the rest of the world, the EU also has to work with this CBAM and make sure that they do it in a way that companies are incentivized to go green around the world. And that's the stated goal of this, is to prevent what they call carbon leakage, which is when you have an energy heavy industry that just moves out of Europe and then pollutes somebody else's ground. Europe is trying to discourage that. But there's always a but. You have developing countries that don't necessarily have very many exportable products. And in some of those countries, particularly in Africa, particularly Mozambique, you have a situation where they will be really hammered by this adjustment mechanism unless some sort of offsetting gets into place. And there are a lot of questions about, is this really fair? Europe got where it was by using cheap energy from the world, and now we're trying to catch up, and they're saying we don't have any cheap energy. So these are policy conversations that we're going to be having for quite some time.
I would have thought that we would have them for quite some time, but I think that they will come side by side with conversations about what's happened to the US and how much of a reliable partner is it and can it be? Do you think that in Asia there's been a long-term hit to US credibility?
There is a lot of reassessment of the American policies that are impacting Asia. But on a positive note, I do want to say this. Asia and Europe, geographically very far apart, but what we are seeing is that they share a lot of concerns and they have many shared challenges. And we are seeing greater coordination and cooperation from Asia and Europe at the institutional level and also at the more country-by-country level as well. The first amazing development had obviously been when NATO invited 4 principal Indo-Pacific countries, namely Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, to become official observers of the NATO alliance. And they have been very supportive of NATO's efforts in assessing the threats of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We've seen a group of NATO officials in Asia over the last couple of weeks, and greater efforts on the part of Japan in particular to help boost weapon access and further military capabilities for NATO. And of course, South Korea is one of the top 10 exporters of military equipment in the world, and it has been very supportive from a military perspective, from an equipment perspective, to Ukraine as well. Now, the challenge in this Europe-Asia cooperation had been oftentimes they end with MOUs and great narratives, but it doesn't lead to specific concrete action plans. But what this concerns and tensions over U.S. policies can actually speed things up and lead to specific concrete cooperation, not just on military security, but hopefully on energy and innovation and some of the other vulnerabilities that we're going to face moving forward as well.
I think that in Europe, one even gives up on saying that it's Europe has had enough of Trump or Europe has had enough of the US. But nonetheless, how do you see it, Rebecca?
This is the situation we're in, and this is the situation we have to work through. Looking for sudden swerves in NATO membership or NATO's role is probably not the most constructive way forward here. This is a long game. Governments will change, political positions will change. And for Europe, part of this is just trying to figure out how to get through the moment and keep options open for the future. I would say for the US in particular, history is echoing in that we are seeing a lot of the same challenges of the late 60s and the early 70s. We saw a rollback of civil rights for racial minorities, for ethnic minorities, for women. We saw changes in the administration. The Nixon era definitely pushed U.S. institutions into some unprecedented ground and really changed the way the institutions relate to each other. And now we're seeing military conflict and even discussions about the return of the draft, which were big deals in the 70s, were huge flashpoints. So in 2 or 3 or 5 years, the U.S. is going to be in a very different place in this debate. We don't know where that will land. There is a lot of uncertainty. But if you're Europe, and particularly if you're China, where the U.S. is your big customer and you play a long game, the incentive is there to try to keep a steady course, not inflame tensions any further, and see how to keep moving forward rather than to have a big change in the status quo. Now, this is not, I don't have any insider knowledge there, but there are a lot of reasons why countries like China that are not part of these alliances will want to take a careful approach.
Yeah. What we are seeing from China is exactly that, the wait and see approach. It had been until quite recently that China could do no right, that whatever actions it took really antagonized the rest of the world, especially when it came to financing with the Belt and Road Initiative, that the debt trap that it was laying out and the like. The narrative has changed. The United States has disappointed many countries, and China can actually just stand and say, look at what the United States is doing and look at what we are offering you, especially for those in the emerging markets, global south. What the Chinese offer is, especially when it comes to development assistance, is not necessarily palatable. There are risks that come with it, but the argument is that at least you know what you're getting. Whereas the United States, oftentimes the rules of engagement, of commitment change. It changes U.S. commitment to its own people changes. We've seen like destructions of USAID, for instance, and many like the overhauls of institutions that have impacted the Washington operates. So there is a lot of reassessment of what China offers. And I also want to point out that China has played the long game, and its latest 5-year plan for economic growth until 2030 makes clear that it wants to be more than just a factory to the world, yes. It wants to be more than just exporting its excess capacity. It actually wants to be a rule maker. And it is prepared to make commitments in itself and outside of its own borders. And when it comes to key critical areas such as in AI and quantum computing and providing services in Africa and Latin America in particular. So we've seen in China that is investing in itself, being consistent in what it is offering and investing outside of its own borders as well. And it is playing a very strong hand. And ironically, too, it also says that it will champion a lot of like the rules-based order as well.
Well, ladies, I mean, clearly we're in a period of huge transition. That is, I think, we can all agree on that without even taking a geopolitical position on it. I would only add to what you were saying, Shihoko, in that I think that China has signaled for a long time that it is interested in taking over the rules-based order and changing the rules if you want to, as opposed to Russia, and I always use this, that wants to demolish that order. Russia has no place in it because it's not strong enough, whereas China is perfectly happy to have it. It just wants everybody to do what it wants, so that's something else. Ladies, that was absolutely great. Thank you so much to Rebecca Christie and Shihoko Goto. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think who would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beitel, together with my friend and producer, Florence Fernando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.